"We're going tomorrow, Mom. I sold your beach house." But she didn't know. I was holding a secret. Click. The call ended, sharp and final, leaving a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. But what my daughter didn't know was, I still held a secret my husband, Henry, had entrusted to me. A secret powerful enough to change everything. I sat frozen in the clinic's waiting room, surrounded by the sharp smell of disinfectant, my ears ringing, my heart clenched as if a hand had wrapped around it. The noise around me faded into nothing. All that remained was the echo of my daughter's voice, flat, clipped, careless, as if I were nothing in her life. 45 years of raising her, sacrificing for her, and in this moment she had tossed me aside like something disposable. My name is Ruth Aldridge. I'm 71 years old. All my life I believed I knew my only daughter, her thoughts, her habits, her dreams. I thought I held her heart in the palm of my hand. But that cold phone call had cut through that belief like a blade. It showed me that decades of love and sacrifice might have meant far less to her than I ever imagined. The pain pressed down on top of another grief. Only 6 months ago, I lost my husband, Henry, the man who had walked beside me for nearly half a century. He wasn't just my husband, he was my confidant, my anchor, the one person I thought would always be there. I can still see that morning as if it happened today. He rose early, just as he always did, carefully making me coffee with a splash of cream, the way I like it. He toasted bread until it was golden and the smell filled the kitchen. Then he came over, bent down, kissed my forehead, his kind eyes meeting mine, his warm voice saying the familiar words, "Good morning, my love." I smiled, my heart fluttering like a young bride's. I had no idea those would be the last words I would ever hear from Henry. Minutes later, he clutched his chest, his face twisting in pain, and collapsed right there on the kitchen floor. It happened so fast I couldn't even comprehend it. I lunged toward him, grasped his hand, calling his name again and again, but his gaze drifted farther and farther away. I never got to squeeze his hand one more time. I never got to whisper a final goodbye. From that moment on, it felt as if my whole world had collapsed. The house that had once been warm and alive turned into a hollow space. The armchair by the window still had the familiar dip where Henry used to sit and read the paper, but now it stood empty. His coat still hung behind the door, the faint scent of his cologne clinging to it. I would stand there for hours, breathing it in while tears streamed down my face. The shed was still cluttered with the tools he used every day, and the old truck sat quietly under the tree, as if waiting for his hands to wash it again. Everything around me screamed that Henry was still here, yet when I called out, no answer ever came back. Night after night, I sat alone in our bedroom, the lamp casting a dim glow on the wedding photo hanging on the wall. I stared at our younger selves smiling at the camera and then broke down. It felt like falling into a bottomless pit where there was only darkness and the sound of my own heart tightening with every beat. People say time dulls pain, but for me, 6 months had passed and the ache was still raw, sharper even, because each morning I woke to nothing but an empty, cold space on the bed beside me. Henry had been my whole life. Losing him felt like losing half my soul. And now, when Cassie, our only daughter, the one we had cherished and poured all our love into, could coldly say the words she just said, it felt like the last strand holding me to this world had been cut. Since Henry died, every morning had been a kind of torture. He used to get up early, the kettle clicking, the smell of coffee filling the house. Now I sat at the table, still pouring 2 cups out of habit, still setting 2 slices of toast on the plate, only to quietly put one away. The chair across from me stayed empty no matter how long I stared at it. Some mornings I even forgot and called out, "Henry, don't forget your coat, it's cold out." Then I'd freeze, the house answering only with the tick-tick of the clock. I'd sink into a chair, covering my face, sobbing. Having a husband beside me had become so ingrained in every breath, every step, that losing him left me feeling like a stranger in my own home. At night, the bedroom felt even heavier. Once Henry had lain beside me, his breathing steady, his large hand holding mine. Now I lay on one side, reaching out only to touch cold sheets. Some nights I buried my face in the pillow he'd left behind, inhaling the familiar scent until it tore something open inside me. Every corner of the house held his presence, but as a constant reminder, he was gone. Through those months, only Cassie kept showing up. She came 3 times a week, taking me to the market, to doctor's appointments, staying for dinner. She would smile, telling me I had to take care of myself now that I was alone. I thought it was genuine concern. My heart warmed a little in the vast emptiness. I told myself at least I still had her, my only child, my last hope. But this morning, hearing Cassie's icy voice over the phone, I realized the truth. It had all been a mask. She'd been preparing for this day all along, the day she would strip me of everything with a single casual phone call. The beach house packed with memories, the old truck that had been Henry's pride, and the fragile hope that I still had a place in my daughter's heart. All I have to do is close my eyes and the beach house floods back in. It was Henry's and my dream for years. We worked ourselves ragged, saved every penny, and only when Cassie turned 15 did we finally have enough to buy the little cream-colored house on the sand. The day Henry handed me the keys, his grip tightened around my hand, his eyes shining like a child's. "Ruth," he said, "from now on we'll have a place where summers truly belong to our family." And it was true. Every summer we went back there. Cassie ran barefoot along the shoreline, her dress whipping in the wind, her footprints trailing over the wet sand. I sat on the porch stitching clothes, watching her laugh, the sound mixing with the crash of the waves. Henry built a charcoal fire, laying the fish he'd just caught onto the grill. The smell of grilled fish, the salt wind, the cheap sunscreen we always bought, all of it blended into the scent of happiness. On bright moonlit nights, we set the table outside, light falling across our 3 faces. Cassie chattered about school. Henry listened and nodded, glancing at me with that proud smile. Later, lulled by the sound of the waves, sleep came easily. I remember lying on the wooden bed, the window cracked open, the briny air drifting in, Henry's warmth beside me, our daughter asleep after a day of play. Back then, I thought this was enough to be content for a lifetime. As Cassie grew older, she began bringing friends to the beach house. The hallways shook with their running and laughter while I spun from one batch of food to another. When she brought Victor for the first time, I laid out a fresh tablecloth and a vase of flowers. I wanted my daughter to feel this was more than a house, it was a home, a place to build her own happiness. And yet now, the place once soaked with our sweat and laughter, for Cassie is nothing but an asset to be sold. She struck the beach house from her life as if erasing every memory. The thought stabbed at me like a knife. And the Ford truck, Henry loved it like a child. Every Sunday he rolled up his sleeves, carried out a bucket of water, scrubbed off every fleck of dirt. He changed the oil himself every 3 months, polished it until that old truck looked almost new. It wasn't just transportation, it was a witness to decades of work, our companion to the beach house, to family visits, hauling plants, carrying furniture for neighbors who needed help. I still remember the smell inside, the smell of Henry. Fresh wood from the boards he kept in the back, the trace of sweat on his work shirts, the mint from the gum he chewed. Sitting in that truck, I felt as if he were still there, only a glance away. Cassie knew this. She knew how precious it was to me. Yet she sold it anyway, as coldly as crossing out an obstacle. I sat in the waiting room, my heart heavy as stone, thinking of everything lost. A phone call of a few clipped sentences, and my only child had tossed aside 45 years of love, family memories, and the last living part of my soul. In that stifling room, I thought I might collapse. But at that moment, a memory flashed, a memory I had almost forgotten. 3 days before Henry died, he had called me over. His face looked tired that day, but his eyes were steady and calm. In his hand was a manila envelope. He gave it to me, his voice warm and low. "Ruth, put this in the dresser drawer. If something ever happens to me, open it when you're ready. Don't rush, wait until you're calm." I had simply nodded, thinking it was just insurance papers or funeral arrangements. I placed it in the drawer, and when the grief hit like a storm after his death, I forgot all about it. For months, my days were nothing but tears and emptiness. I had no room in my mind for that envelope. But this morning, as soon as I heard Cassie's cold announcement about the house and the truck, the memory of that envelope came alive. It was like a small light flickering in the suffocating dark. A strange certainty rose in me. Henry had never left me adrift. All his life he had planned, worried, prepared. Why would this be any different? No, I believed he had left me something in that envelope. I walked out of the clinic with my follow-up appointment slip in hand. The doctor had said my health was fine. I just needed to rest and eat better. I nodded and smiled politely, but my mind was already elsewhere, on that drawer, on the manila envelope waiting in my bedroom. Outside, the midday sun beat down on my shoulders as I walked to the bus stop. Without Henry's truck to pick me up, I didn't feel small. I sat on the bench, listening to the city's noise, watching people rush by. Everyone carries their own secrets, their own pain. So do I. Cassie thinks she's taken everything, left me with nothing. She has no idea I still hold a key, a legacy Henry quietly left in my hands. When the bus arrived, I chose a seat by the window. The city slid past, crowded houses, glowing shop signs, hurried faces. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, and to my own surprise, a smile crept onto my lips. A smile mixed with pain, fatigue, and a new calm. Cassie might think she buried me with one careless phone call, but the truth was the opposite. In trying to strip me bare, she had woken me up. And that envelope held the answer to everything. When I got home, I didn't bother changing clothes or putting anything away. I went straight upstairs to the bedroom. The dresser drawer was still there, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. My heart pounded as I pulled it open, and there it was, the yellow envelope resting exactly where I had left it. On the outside, in Henry's neat handwriting, were the words, "For Ruth." I knew that writing instantly. He had signed papers with it, left me notes in the same careful script for years. Just seeing it made my hands tremble. I picked up the envelope, my old fingers shaking, a mix of anticipation and fear running through me. It took me a long moment before I dared to break the seal. Inside was not just a single sheet, but a thick stack of documents. I spread them out on the bed, sat down, took a deep breath, and began to look through them. First came legal papers, property deeds, bank accounts, savings books, then documents connected to a company I had never heard of. I kept turning pages and found shares in several businesses, some names familiar, some not. My head spun. Henry, my Henry, had been a bus driver his whole life. Every day he wore the faded green uniform, cap perched on his head. He left before dawn and came home at dusk, and he always told me that a simple meal with me and Cassie was the greatest joy in his life. Never once had I imagined he had quietly built something so vast. Finally, I reached the last page, a handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed with time, but Henry's script was still steady and clear. Tears blurred my eyes as I read, "My dearest Ruth, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer by your side. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but all I ever wanted was for you to feel at peace, never worrying about money. Every paycheck, every dollar we saved, I invested little by little, quietly, patiently. Because of that, you now have more than the beach house. You own 6 other houses, an apartment building where Cassie lives, and shares in 3 companies. All of it is in your name." I sat there stunned, my heart pounding. Memories flooded back. Every time I wanted a new dress or a new set of furniture, Henry would say, "Let's save it for later, Ruth." I used to pout, thinking he was being stingy, never realizing he was building a future beyond my imagination. I read on, "Be careful, Ruth. Cassie is our daughter. I love her, but I know her well. She is easily swayed by money. I kept this hidden so she wouldn't change, so her love for us would stay true. If one day she discovers the truth, I fear she won't be the same Cassie we once knew." I lowered the letter, tears streaming down my face. Henry had foreseen this. He had carried the burden alone to protect us, to protect her. And all those years I had believed he was simply a hard-working husband, never realizing he was also a quiet guardian, planning for the days when he would no longer be here. I flipped through the rest of the stack, my eyes blurring at the numbers. Bank accounts with sums I had never dared dream of, land deeds from decades ago, share certificates all bearing my name, everything laid out neatly, organized, as if Henry had prepared a roadmap for me to follow the moment I opened that drawer. I sat there for hours, reading, remembering. Henry had driven a bus for 40 years, never once complaining about the grind. He used to say, "As long as I have you and Cassie waiting at home, I have all the strength I need." I never imagined that behind that simple uniform was a man who had quietly mastered the art of planning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, brushing my hand over the worn curtains, the faded table, the old family photographs on the wall, all the things Cassie had dismissed as outdated. I lingered longest at one picture, Cassie at 5 years old, sitting in Henry's lap, laughing with her whole face. I asked myself when that sweet child had turned into the cold woman I had heard on the phone that morning. Outside, the darkness pressed in. I sat by the window, the envelope and letter still in my hands. Gratitude swelled in me, mingled with a slow, steady ache. Henry was gone, but he was still here, guiding me, protecting me as he always had. And now I understood Cassie's phone call wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Henry had already paved a road for me to walk. I whispered as if he could still hear me. "Henry, I understand now. Don't worry. I won't let what you built fall into the wrong hands. And I'll show Cassie that money will never define love." The wind rustled outside the window like a gentle reply. I closed my eyes, tears slipping down my face. But for the first time in months, I felt a spark inside me, a small flame burning in the dark. The flame of resolve, of a woman who once seemed fragile, but now had every reason to stand up again. The next morning, I put on the wine-colored dress Henry used to say made me look elegant. I carefully brushed my hair and dabbed on a pale lipstick. In the mirror, I no longer saw the weary widow I'd been. I saw someone else, older, alert, and with a reason to stand up. I decided to go see Gerald Whitman, the lawyer Henry had trusted for years. He'd been at the funeral. I remembered him saying, "If you need anything, call me." His office was downtown in an old, dignified building. When I walked in, Gerald rose and shook my hand, surprise flickering across his face at how composed I looked. I took the yellow envelope and the stack of papers Henry had left and set them on his desk. "Please look through these," I said. "Henry gave them to me before he died." Gerald read carefully, brow furrowing now and then. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the clock. Finally, he looked up, voice low. "Mrs. Ruth, all of these documents are in order. Your husband prepared very thoroughly. According to these papers, you are the legal owner of all the assets, properties, companies, shares, including the building where Cassie and Victor live." I nodded, part stunned, part bitter. Gerald hesitated, then lowered his voice. "About the beach house. Do you know your daughter sold it?" I exhaled. "Yes. Cassie called me. That sale was illegal," he said bluntly. "The house is owned by Henry's company, and you are the lawful owner. Cassie had no right to sell. I can file suit right away, reclaim the house, and seek damages." I was silent for a long time. Cassie's face flashed through my head. Indifferent, cold, her words cutting like knives. I could drag her into court, expose her in public, make her pay now. But then I thought of Henry and his letter. I'm afraid Cassie will change if she learns. If I made a scene, she'd only see me as an enemy. She wouldn't learn anything but anger. I looked Gerald in the eye. "No, I don't want to sue. I want this kept quiet. I need you to quietly restore control of the assets to me, but I don't want Cassie to find out." Gerald seemed surprised. "Are you sure? This is your chance to right a wrong. I will get what is rightfully mine," I said, "but not through the public courts. I want Cassie to feel the consequences herself, to learn the lesson she's never been taught." Gerald paused, then nodded. "Very well. If that's your wish, I'll handle it discreetly." For the first time in months, a small weight lifted. I gave him a faint smile. From that day on, I played my part like a seasoned actor. Out in public, I remained the pitiful widow, slow at the market, wearing old sweaters, telling neighbors in a soft voice, "I'll take things day by day now." They brought food, patted my shoulder, murmured comforts. I accepted it all, thanked them, praised the casserole, then put the container straight into the fridge. Their pity became my perfect disguise. Behind closed doors, everything was different. I folded my knitted shawl and opened Henry's file. At first, the numbers overwhelmed me. Accounts, contracts, share certificates, pages full of printed clauses. I won't lie. In the beginning, I was confused, my eyes skimming over terms I didn't understand. But I didn't give up. I called Gerald and asked about every line. He explained patiently. I wrote down the words he used, then went home and looked up terms, asked the teller at the bank to show me how to read statements properly. Slowly, the figures stopped being mysteries. They became a map. I learned to hide the small joys when I could mark an item done. No cheering, no boasting. Those private satisfactions warmed me inside. Afternoons, Marta Delgado would pop in for tea, chattering about my health. I sat knitting in front of her like a gentle old woman, but my eyes never left the folder on the table. When Marta left, I'd flip the file open again, tick off completed tasks, and call Gerald with detailed instructions. Make sure it's quiet. Don't let anyone suspect. He always replied, "I understand, Mrs. Ruth." Once the buyer of the beach house came to the door, asking about the sale. I stayed silent and let Gerald take care of it. He made the calls, handled the paperwork. All of it happened behind a curtain. To the neighbors, I was still the abandoned mother, tearful and betrayed, never revealing the steady steps I was taking. Acting wasn't difficult. It only required small details, a slightly tremulous voice at the right moment, sorrowful eyes placed just so, and people will believe whatever story you let them see. In the kitchen, I stuck Post-its to the cupboard. Phone numbers, appointment dates, clauses to sign. I left my notebook beside the broom so visitors would think I was occupied with housework. In truth, I was reassigning ownership of every house, every certificate, waiting to bring everything back under my control. I opened a new bank account, set up corporate paperwork under Gerald's guidance. Quiet, methodical, invisible. The more I read, the more I admired Henry's prudence. He had purchased and invested without ever worrying our family. Now, reading his careful arrangements, I felt both anger and gratitude. Anger at Cassie for treating our life like disposable goods, and deep thanks that Henry had planned for this day. He had thought of me. At night, I still lay alone in bed, but it was different from before. Instead of drowning in hopelessness, I ran through the steps I'd taken, the calls I'd made, and felt a small calm settle. Cassie's phone call had become a bell. It had woken me up, not to collapse, but to stand. I wasn't doing this for theatrical revenge in public. I was doing it so she would feel the consequences of her choices. Piece by piece, a lesson that sinks into the bones. I would let her live in the reality she had chosen. Fall, pick herself up, and if she needed a hand, it would be my hand. Not to rescue her back into the same old self, but to help her rebuild into someone who understood responsibility. That, to me, was rightful justice, quiet, clever, and unavoidable. So when the neighbor tutted, "Poor thing, her daughter left her," I only smiled and nodded to ease their worry. In my mind, I knew they were helping me hide the plan, and when the time came, I would reveal the cards one by one, letting Cassie see exactly what she'd wagered and what she'd lost. Gerald worked quickly, but just as discreetly as I had asked. Within 2 weeks, he had contacted the so-called buyer of the beach house, presented the legal proof that Cassie had no right to sell it, and nullified the entire contract. The man wasn't happy, of course, but the law was clear. I was the legal owner. Every document bore my name, not Cassie's. Gerald handled it smoothly, without a single rumor reaching Cassie's ears. He told me, "The house is back under your name, Ruth. If you'd like, I can arrange for you to visit, to check on everything." I nodded, my heart heavy and light all at once. The day I returned to the beach house, my chest trembled as if I were walking into an old dream. The narrow, sand-covered road still curved around, palm trees casting shadows across the porch. The cream-colored house stood there quietly, as if it had been waiting. I opened the door, and the smell of old wood and salt air rushed out, so familiar that tears spilled down my cheeks. I wandered from room to room. In the living room, I could almost hear little Cassie running in circles, hair flying, laughter ringing. On the porch, I could see Henry cleaning his fishing rod while I set out a plate of grilled fish. Every corner of the house held a memory, replaying like old film reels. I pressed my hand to the wall and felt the rhythm of the ocean inside me. Then the bitterness hit. All of these memories, Cassie had reduced to a line on a contract, traded away for money and travel. To her, this house was just paperwork, just numbers in an account. She had forgotten this was where her childhood lived, where family dinners and summers full of laughter once thrived. I sat down on the wooden chair on the porch, staring at the sea, tears sliding down my face. "Henry, can you see? She's forgotten everything." But I wiped my face quickly. This was no time for weakness. The house was back in my hands, and that was only the first step. Gerald had told me, "Henry's truck, you can reclaim that too. It's still under your name." The thought stirred something fierce inside me. That truck was more than property. It was Henry's blood and sweat, the companion he cared for year after year. He had cherished every detail, treated it like a friend. I couldn't let it slip away, couldn't let Cassie treat it like another item to sell. That night, I spread the truck papers across the dining table. Gerald promised to handle the legal work, but I wanted to be part of it myself. I made calls, asked about the process, wrote down every detail. My eyes blurred with fatigue, but inside I felt clearer than ever. To truly teach Cassie the lesson she needed, it wasn't just about assets. It was about restoring every piece of Henry's legacy, every memory that defined our family. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood, my pitiful widow image remained intact. Marta Delgado, my next-door neighbor, often stopped by with fresh bread, sighing as she set it down. Poor Ruth, left all alone, even her daughter gives her trouble. I smiled faintly and replied, "Well, I just have to endure." Irene Walsh, the widow across the street, sometimes brought soup or vegetables. They sat with me, glancing sadly around my worn-down home. In their eyes, I was just an abandoned old woman living on scraps of kindness. I let them think that. In fact, I leaned into the role, knitting by the window so they'd see me busying myself. When they asked about Cassie, I only sighed. That silence told its own story. Ruth, left behind by her daughter, scraping by. The story spread quickly, becoming the perfect curtain over my real work. At night, when the house fell quiet, I pulled out the files again and called Gerald. His voice was steady, his updates precise. "The beach house is secure under your name. The truck, nearly resolved. After that, the apartments and the shares will go step by step, quietly." I answered, "Good. Let's keep it silent. When the time is right, the truth will reveal itself." The next day, I returned to the beach house once more, this time walking along the sand. Waves lapped at my feet, the sea breeze whipping through my graying hair. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me. I could almost hear little Cassie shouting, "Mom, look at the sandcastle I made." Henry's laugh echoed as he lifted her high in the air. When I opened my eyes, the shore was empty, but instead of breaking down, I clenched my fist. I whispered, "It's all right, Henry. I'll protect everything that belongs to you, to us. And I'll let Cassie learn the lesson she needs." My counterattack had begun. That afternoon, the heat pressed down so hard the house felt like it might swallow itself. I had barely settled into the armchair, my back not yet relaxed, when frantic pounding shook the front door. A rapid, chaotic hammering, nothing like the polite knocks from Marta or Irene. My heart sank, a bad feeling flared in my chest. I opened the door. Standing there was Cassie, my only child. But she was no longer the tidy, proud woman with the bright red lipstick and crisp dresses from months ago. This Cassie was a different person. Hollow-cheeked and gray, eyes ringed in dark bruises, hair matted and falling out in clumps. Her shirt was wrinkled and stained, the hem of her pants frayed, one stiletto missing a heel. She clutched an old, battered rolling suitcase, its stuck wheel scraping the tile as she dragged it in. Her eyes were puffy and raw, like someone who hadn't slept or stopped crying for days. The gold necklace she used to flaunt was gone. Only the greenish bruise where it had lain marked her skin. Before I could find words, she broke apart, voice jagged and strangled. "Mom, Victor left me. He's with someone else and he left me with a mountain of debt. I have nothing left." Those shattered words scraped across me. That trembling, frightened voice was a world away from the cold, dismissive tone she'd used on the phone. "I sold the house. I sold the truck. We needed the money." Then she sounded like a stranger. Now, standing before me, she was like a lost child, exhausted, pleading. My chest tightened. I felt both pity and anger. Pity because, after all, she was my blood, the girl I carried and raised for 45 years. Anger because she had chosen that path, chasing illusions, trampling family bonds, and ending up empty-handed. I moved aside and opened the door wider. She staggered in, the suitcase whining across the floor, as if dragging her debts and mistakes with her. I poured her a glass of water. Her hand shook so badly the water sloshed over the rim. She sank into a chair, curled in on herself, hands pressed to her face, sobbing like a child. Her hair fell in a tangle over her face. Only the broken hiccups filled the room. I sat across from her and watched in silence. Months in Europe that had seemed like paradise. The glamour she chased, now reduced to this. My daughter, ragged and hollow, sitting in her childhood home like a fallen leaf about to drop. But fate hadn't finished. A few days later, while she was still drifting around the house, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. Cassie tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was an eviction notice from the apartment she and Victor used to share. The printed words were blunt and cold. Tenant no longer has right to occupy the premises. Please vacate within 15 days. I knew the truth. That apartment had already been put under my control. Gerald had taken care of the paperwork. Everything was legal, airtight. But Cassie didn't know. To her, that paper was another knife thrust into whatever hope remained. She went numb, the paper falling from her slack hand. Her eyes glazed, staring into nothing. Then, as if drained of strength, she crumpled to the floor and sobbed. Her voice broke into fragments. "Mom, I know I was wrong. I have nowhere else to go. Please let me stay. I promise I'll change." I sat motionless, looking at my daughter on the floor. Her shoulders heaved with each sob, hair matted and hiding half her face. For the first time in years, I saw Cassie stripped of the armor of pride. Nothing left but raw, naked despair. A rush of emotions rose inside me. Part of me wanted to scoop her up and comfort her the way I did when she was small. Another part heard Henry's words from his letter echo in my head. "I'm afraid Cassie will change because of money. I only hope she learns what truly matters." I sighed and laid a hand on her shoulder. "Now get up, dear. Stay here with me. If the house is poor, we'll bear it together. I won't let you sleep on the street." She looked up, eyes blurring, as if clutching the last lifeline. She had no idea that in that very moment I had made my decision. I would take her in, but not to let her lean on me as before. I would keep the truth hidden and let her learn the lesson she needed, step by step. Cassie clung to me, sobbing like a child. Her tears soaked through my shoulder, her body trembling in broken waves. She didn't know that at that very moment in the drawer of my desk lay a thick stack of papers, each page proof that she had been wrong. Everything she once claimed as hers had already returned to its rightful place. And I, the mother she had so easily cast aside, was quietly building a lesson she would never be able to escape. In the days that followed, Cassie stayed with me. She drifted through the old kitchen, hands that once only held wine glasses and phones now fumbling with knives and vegetables, sometimes slipping and nicking her fingers. Other times she clumsily swept the floor, the stiff straw broom scattering more dust than it gathered. I sat at the table pretending to read the paper, though my heart ached watching her. My daughter, who had once walked so confidently through glittering restaurants, was now smudged with dirt, trapped in a house with cracked tiles and peeling paint. Sometimes I caught her standing at the window, staring out into the empty yard. In her eyes flickered remnants of her old pride, the look that once made her hold her head high among friends, even with me. But it always faded quickly, smothered by the weight of reality. No new clothes, no designer bags, no Victor whispering sweet nothings. Now there was only a broken-down house, an old mother she had discarded, and small chores to fill the days. One night, just as I was about to switch off the light, I heard soft whispers coming from her room. I paused, leaned close to the half-closed door. Her voice cracked, low but clear. If only I hadn't sold the beach house. If only I hadn't treated Mom that way. I froze, my hand gripping the doorframe. My throat tightened, tears stung my eyes. The first lesson had seeped in. The lesson of loss, of regret. But I knew the road ahead was longer. She would need to stumble further, learn more before she could truly rise again. And I, though my heart twisted, would stay silent, letting this quiet plan of mine unfold. That night, I sat at the table and pulled out Henry's letter, unfolding its yellowed pages. Slowly, I read each line he had written about Cassie. I hope she learns the true value of life, not just the lure of money. His handwriting wavered but stayed firm, like a message meant to cross time itself. I whispered into the empty room as if Henry were sitting across from me. "Don't worry, Henry. I'll teach her the way you wanted. Not with words, but with the life she will be forced to live." Outside, the night wind slid through the cracks in the window, carrying the damp scent of earth. Crickets sang, underscoring the heavy thoughts weighing down my heart. Inside the little house, two women shared the same roof, eating the same humble meal. But between us lingered a secret only I carried, and one I would guard until the day Cassie finally understood. One morning, as I was bent over the sink scrubbing dishes, I heard Cassie call out, her voice unsteady. "Mom, what's this?" I froze. Something in her tone, surprise mixed with confusion, made me set the plate down and wipe my hands. When I stepped into her old bedroom, still carrying the stale dampness of years of neglect, I found her sitting on the floor. In her hands was a yellowed envelope, its corners frayed from age. Across the front, in handwriting I knew by heart, was my name, Ruth. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart seemed to miss a beat, clamped tight in my chest. Cassie looked up at me, her eyes still swollen and bloodshot from endless sleepless nights. Yet within them flickered something strange. Not warmth, but curiosity laced with hope. Her voice trembled as she asked, almost urgently, "I found this in Victor's suitcase. I don't know why it was there. This handwriting, is it Dad's?" My hands shook as I took the envelope from her. The rough texture beneath my fingertips told me everything. Yes, it was Henry's hand. That slight tilt, the careful, deliberate strokes. I would have known it blind. A sharp ache pierced my chest. I drew a deep breath and opened the envelope in front of her. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and a small silver key. The note read, "Ruth, if you are reading this after opening the first envelope, it means Cassie is in real trouble. This key belongs to safe deposit box 247 at the central bank. Inside are things you can use to help her, but please think carefully before you do. Don't rush. Let her first understand the true value of life before handing her anything." I finished reading, my throat tight. Even from beyond the grave, Henry had planned each step. He had been watching over me, and Cassie, in ways I never could have imagined. Cassie's gaze locked onto the key in my palm, her eyes lighting up with desperate brightness, like a drowning person spotting a lifeline. She grabbed my hand, her voice tumbling out in a rush. "Mom, let's go open it. Maybe Dad left something in there. I could use it to clear the debts." In her voice, I heard two layers, fear pressing hard against her chest and blind desperation clawing for relief. She wasn't thinking about the wounds between us or the mistakes that led here. She didn't care whether I was ready to share it. All she saw was money, a way to rescue Victor, a way to rescue herself. I nodded slowly. I couldn't refuse her in that moment. The next morning, Cassie and I went quietly to the central bank. The vault beneath the building was cold as a tomb, endless rows of safe deposit boxes lining the walls like steel coffins. When the clerk slid the key into box 247 and the lock clicked open, my heart thudded as if Henry himself were somewhere in the shadows, watching. The heavy door swung outward. Not papers, not savings bonds, but rows of velvet boxes in green and red. Cassie's hands shook as she opened them one by one. Light burst from diamonds, emeralds, rubies, and strands of luminous white pearls, glinting under the yellow ceiling lamps. I recognized some as pieces from Henry's mother, but many were unfamiliar, things he must have bought and hidden away in silence. Cassie stared, breathless, whispering as she lifted the pearls with trembling fingers. "Oh my God, this must be a fortune. Mom, we can sell it. With this money, I can pay off Victor's debts." Her eyes blazed. Not with gratitude, but with a desperate greed. I stood beside her, bitter inside. Even now, standing before the treasures Henry had left behind, her first thought was still of Victor. The man who betrayed her, walked away with someone else, and left her drowning in debt. I sighed and spoke slowly. "Think carefully, Cassie. This is your father's legacy. It isn't just money. She pressed her lips tight, her eyes flickering as though she was fighting herself. She murmured, almost to no one, "I know, but if I don't pay them, they'll take everything. I have no other choice." Her voice shook, eyes glistening with fear, and that stubborn streak I knew so well. Cassie was still Cassie, always believing money could fix anything, even if it meant selling the memories of her dead father. We brought the jewelry back home. Cassie immediately began scouring for buyers, but the world wasn't as simple as she thought. Some shopkeepers took one look and dismissed her. Some questioned the origins. Some haggled and tried to slash the price. From morning until night, she dragged herself from store to store, her shoes coated in dust, her heels rubbed raw and bleeding. At last, she managed to sell a few pieces, but for barely half of what she had imagined. That night, I found her sitting alone at the kitchen table under the weak yellow light. In front of her lay a stack of worn bills she had carefully sorted into small piles. She counted again and again, 10, 20, 30, her lips moving like a prayer. But the more she counted, the lower her shoulders sank. Her face was gaunt, carved with disappointment. She looked up, eyes red, and whispered, "This is all, Mom. It's not enough." Her voice cracked, laced with helplessness and bitterness. I sat across from her, my heart torn between pity and pain. I wanted to reach out, to tell her it was all right, that everything was already under my control. But I held back. Henry had told me, let her learn the true value for herself. This was the moment. I only nodded slightly and let silence fill the kitchen. Cassie bowed her head, her trembling hands gathering the small bills, her eyes vacant as if the world had just dealt her another cruel blow. And in that instant, I knew she had taken one more step down into the very bottom of the pit. In the days that followed, Cassie threw herself into the humiliating task of looking for work. She had once lived cushioned in comfort, accustomed to soft chairs, polished clothes, and being served. The idea of preparing resumes and knocking on doors had never crossed her mind. But now she had no choice. Each morning she dressed in faded clothes and carried a handful of papers printed in haste. Her steps dragged as she moved from office buildings to small shops to corner diners. Everywhere she went, eyes scanned her from head to toe before shaking their heads. Some turned her away politely with a stiff smile. Others were blunt. "We need experience. You don't have any." One even scoffed, "Didn't you have debt problems? We don't want that here." Every rejection carved deeper lines of shame into her face. She walked away hunched, as if she'd swallowed a stone that lodged in her throat. One stifling afternoon, long before the sun went down, Cassie stumbled back through the door. Sweat drenched her, her blouse plastered to her back. She opened her mouth, her voice cracked and rough. "They don't want me, Mom. Everyone says I'm not qualified." I poured a glass of water and pushed it toward her. She drank in one gulp, her hands trembling. I only said quietly, "Drink. Tomorrow you'll try again." She looked at me as if searching for more, but I gave her nothing. This was a path she had to walk alone. Day after day, she kept at it. Sometimes she came home late, eyes hollow, her shoes worn down, blisters raised on her hands from lugging her folder around. Once I overheard her whisper in the dark, voice breaking, "Am I really that useless?" By the third week, she finally landed a job. Night cleaning shifts in a downtown office tower. The pay was little more than scraps, but at least it was a beginning. Her first night back, it was nearly midnight. I heard the rattle of the key before Cassie stepped inside. She reeked of bleach, her clothes stained and spotted, her hands raw and red from harsh chemicals. Dropping her canvas bag on a chair, she collapsed at the table, breath ragged, stripped of every trace of glamour she once paraded. I had a bowl of hot porridge ready. She ate quietly, exhausted, too weary to hold on to pride. A few days later, while we cleared the dinner table, she told me about a woman from her shift, Patricia Green. Patricia was past 60, small and stooped from years of labor, yet her eyes were bright and her voice strong. Cassie recited her words slowly. "Sweetheart, every job has value. If the world doesn't respect you, then you must respect yourself. Money you earn with your own hands, it might be little, but it's clean, and it's yours to be proud of." Cassie repeated those words with an almost distant look, her voice softer than usual. I noticed a pause, a quietness in her I hadn't seen before. as though a seed had been planted in her mind. From then on, Cassie began to change. She stopped sleeping until noon, rose earlier, slipped into my simpler rhythm of life. She tracked every coin, spent carefully, no longer tossing money away the moment it hit her hand. She washed her clothes by hand, clumsily at first, fingers cracked from soap and water, but her eyes carried patience. She ventured into the kitchen, learning to boil vegetables, fry an egg, cook rice. The meals were humble, a salad, a golden omelet. But she ate with surprising satisfaction, even sighing once, "I never thought a meal like this could feel warm." I watched her quietly, my heart torn between sorrow and relief. Sorrow for the hardship she endured, relief because at last she was learning the value of labor, of money honestly earned. One evening, while we stood side by side washing dishes, Cassie spoke in a low, fragile voice. "Mom, I never imagined I'd end up doing these things. But now I feel lighter. At least I know I can still stand on my own feet." When she finished, she smiled. A rare, weary, honest smile, nothing like the proud smirk she once wore. I looked at her, my heart aching yet glowing. "Henry," I thought, "perhaps your lesson is finally beginning to take root in her." Outside, autumn winds drifted in, carrying the smell of wood smoke from neighboring homes. Inside our little house, Cassie no longer whispered, "if only." Instead, for the first time, she began to speak of tomorrow, her voice still tired but laced with a fragile hope. One morning, I woke Cassie early. She stirred, lifting bloodshot eyes to me, deep purple shadows bruised beneath them. Nights of cleaning shifts and the weight of her worries had stripped her down, leaving her thin and hollow. The sound of my voice made her flinch, but she didn't argue. She just sat up, too drained to resist. I spoke firmly with no room for debate. "Get dressed. You're coming with me. We're meeting someone today." For a moment she froze, confusion flickering in her gaze. Then she only nodded, silent. The old Cassie, who would have snapped back, questioned me, dug in her heels, was gone. Hardship had carved away her pride. When we stopped in front of a small downtown office, Cassie stiffened. She read the name etched on the brass plaque, Gerald Whitman, attorney. Her hand clenched the fraying strap of her bag, her eyes widening with alarm. "A lawyer?" she rasped. "Mom, why are we here? I don't have money for this." I laid a calm hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry. He was your father's friend. He wants to help us. He won't charge a cent." Cassie pressed her lips together and lowered her eyes. She asked nothing more, trailing me inside. Gerald Whitman emerged from his office to greet us. A man in his 60s, silver hair thinning, a kind face but sharp eyes that seemed to weigh everything. He shook my hand, then turned to Cassie with a small, sincere smile. "Hello, Cassie. Please sit. There are some important things we need to discuss." Cassie lowered herself into the leather chair, her body taut. Her fingers twisted together, rubbing until the skin flushed red. She looked like a violin string stretched to breaking, her eyes darting nervously, as if bracing for a verdict. Gerald opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of files. The sound of paper rustling made Cassie jolt upright, her spine rigid. He spread the documents out carefully and spoke with deliberate clarity. "First, you need to know the truth about Victor. He used your name to borrow a large sum. But these records prove you are not responsible." Cassie's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Color drained from her face, her lips trembling. "Not responsible? But I thought—" Her voice broke apart, disbelief catching in her throat. Gerald nodded, sliding the stack toward her. "Here's the evidence. Every loan is under Victor's name, tied to his false statements. I've already confirmed with the bank. Cassie, you don't owe his debts. You don't have to carry them anymore." Her frail hands shook as she gripped the file. She scanned each page feverishly, as though hunting for a mistake, some line that proved the nightmare was real. But the further she read, the blurrier her eyes became. Tears spilled, soaking the print, smearing the ink. She covered her mouth, a sob breaking free. "Oh God, all this time, I've been living like it was my burden, and it was all lies." I watched her, pain cutting through me. My heart ached for the months she had suffered unjustly, yet it also burned with sorrow that she had once abandoned us to chase a man who betrayed her. Gerald leaned back, his sigh heavy. His voice was steady but gentle. Sometimes the truth is cruel, Cassie, but necessary. You haven't lost everything you thought you had. The room thickened with silence. Cassie clutched the file, trembling as though she'd just woken from a nightmare. Her eyes lifted to me, filled with fear, regret, and a childlike plea for guidance. And in that moment, I knew the time had come to reveal the rest of the truth. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep it hidden any longer. Slowly, I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope, the one I had guarded for so long, so many times ready to hand over, but always stopping myself. I laid it on the table directly in front of Cassie. Cassie, there's something you need to know. Your father left more behind than you think. She flinched, her eyes darting up at me, wide and unsteady. The word father alone made her tremble, like touching a wound not yet healed. I pushed the envelope toward her, my voice steady. These are the documents proving ownership of your father's assets. Not just the beach house, not just the truck, but shares in companies and the investments he built quietly, year after year. The room froze. Cassie's hand trembled as she touched the envelope. She pulled out the papers one by one, scanning them quickly, then stopping to read each line. At first her face was tight, disbelieving. Then her expression sagged, her lips parted, her breath quickened. When the truth became undeniable, she looked up, tears brimming. Her voice cracked. Mom, you knew all this from the beginning? I nodded calmly. Yes, I knew, and I stayed silent. For a second, that silence struck her like a knife. Cassie broke down, sobs bursting out, raw and guttural. She cried out, her voice jagged with pain. Why, Mom? Why did you let me suffer? Why let me pawn jewelry, drag myself from shop to shop? Why let me knock on doors only to be humiliated? Why let me scrub toilets, do things I never thought I'd touch in my life? Why didn't you tell me from the start? Her tears fell onto the papers, staining the ink, smearing the proof of everything she had misunderstood. She looked at me, her eyes aching with hurt. Part accusation, part desperate plea for an answer. I drew a deep breath, locking my eyes with hers so she could see the resolve in mine. My voice came slow and deliberate, each word carved into the still air. Because you needed to learn, Cassie. You needed to learn the value of family, of responsibility, of respect. Money that comes too easily blinds you, makes you despise everything else. But every drop of sweat you shed, every cold stare when you begged for work, every blister on your hands, those are what teach you the real worth of things. She sat frozen, lips trembling, unable to form words. Her face twisted with conflict, her eyes drowning in the realization of something greater than herself. I went on, my tone softer but unyielding. Do you remember? Your father said it himself. What he feared most wasn't you being poor. It was you losing your character. He wanted you to cherish, to respect even the smallest things. And my silence was the only way to make sure you learned. In the heavy quiet, only her muffled sobs broke the air. Cassie collapsed, burying her face in her hands, her whole body shaking. Every trace of pride was gone. I rose and wrapped my arms around her. For the first time in years, she let me hold her. No resistance, no struggle. She pressed her face into my shoulder, her voice shattering through the sobs. Mom, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was blind. I hurt you. I hurt Dad. I stroked her sweat-damp hair, my eyes burning, half my burden lifting with her words. All the pain, all the bitterness. In that moment, it melted into tears. Cassie, my Cassie, had finally begun to change. Gerald, who had watched in silence from the start, quietly gathered the papers. He stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. His voice was low, warm. I believe Henry would be smiling to see this. I nodded, a hot tear rolling down my cheek. And in that moment, I heard Henry's voice as if it were carried on the air. Tender, unwavering. I hope she learns the true value, not just the price of money. I held my daughter tight, whispering back in my heart, Henry, you can rest easy. The day you hoped for has finally come. In my arms, Cassie sobbed so hard her tears soaked through my blouse. She couldn't form full sentences, only choked out the same broken words over and over. Mom, I was wrong. I was so foolish. Her hands clung to mine, trembling like a child terrified of being abandoned. After a long while, she finally forced herself to lift her head. Her eyes were swollen and red, her voice hoarse. "Mom, please let me stay. Let me start over." Then she lowered her face again, twisting the hem of her shirt between her fingers, unable to meet my gaze. I said nothing, only reached up to smooth her hair. In that moment, I no longer saw the proud woman who had once dismissed her family as nothing. All I saw was a lost child who had stumbled, begging for a place to come home to. Gerald quietly rose, closing his briefcase and slipping out of the room without a word. That left only the two of us side by side on the old wooden chair. Cassie still sniffled now and then, her hand never letting go of mine, gripping tight as if afraid she might lose me again. From the day we met Gerald, I began to notice Cassie changing little by little. She no longer came home from her night shifts with complaints. Her hands were still raw from the chemicals. Her clothes still carried the sharp scent of bleach. But in her eyes, there was no longer confusion or shame. Instead, I saw acceptance and even a glimmer of pride. One morning, as I was tidying up the kitchen, Cassie set her worn fabric bag on the table and said softly, but with steady conviction, "Mom, I've made up my mind. I'm going to keep working there. Not for the money, but because I need the discipline. I need to do it on my own, pay my own dues, and stop leaning on anyone else." I looked at her, and a wave of emotion rose in me. Once, the smallest scratch on her hand would have sent her into endless complaints. Now, she was choosing to keep a hard job, almost as if punishing and healing herself at the same time. I didn't stop her. I knew this was the right path. On many late nights after she returned from work, we would sit together in the small kitchen. Cassie would pour 2 cups of tea, one for her, one for me, and begin sharing stories of her co-workers. Mrs. Patricia Green, over 60, her back bent from years of labor yet still working tirelessly. A poor student scraping together tuition, a single mother trading away her sleep to feed her children. As Cassie spoke, her eyes shone with a kind of empathy I had never seen in her before. One evening, she grew quiet, then turned to me. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot. I want to go back to school. Not to study something glamorous or showy, but to study social work. I want to help women who've gone through what I did, lost, misled, deceived. I want to be a hand they can hold on to instead of letting them sink deeper." For a moment, I was stunned. This was the same daughter who once dreamed only of exotic trips and fine dining, now telling me she wanted to dedicate herself to helping others. Slowly, I nodded, my voice trembling. "If that's what you want, I'll support you." If Henry could hear this, I'm sure he'd be smiling. From then on, Cassie worked nights and studied by day. She signed up for supplemental classes, spent her afternoons poring over books, sometimes asking me to borrow materials for her. I saw the toll it took, the dark circles under her eyes, the moments when she slumped over the table with exhaustion. But I also saw her persistence, her newfound determination. One evening, she took my hand and said, "Mom, I don't want to just take from you and Dad. I want to build something with you, so what Dad left behind won't just be wealth, but something meaningful for others." That was when the idea of a foundation took shape. At first, it was just a vague thought, but soon we were planning in earnest. Together, Cassie and I decided to use part of Henry's estate to establish a foundation in his name. Its mission would be to support women who had been deceived, single mothers struggling to survive, and anyone who needed a place to begin again. On the day we announced the foundation, Cassie trembled with nerves. She stood beside me, no longer the weak, weeping daughter who once begged to stay. She looked poised, grown. When she spoke a few words to the gathered crowd, her voice still wavered, but her eyes were steady. I watched her and felt peace wash over me. My daughter had truly grown after all her losses. From then on, our relationship transformed as well. It was no longer me instructing while she resisted. Now we sat side by side talking about studies, about the foundation, about life. I was still her mother, but we were also 2 women working together. She asked for my opinions, listened carefully, and offered her own views. What once felt like distance and disagreement now felt like connection and respect. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, Cassie gave me a small smile. "Mom, I used to think you were too strict, but now I understand. You let me fall so I could learn to stand. That pain, it saved me." I squeezed her hand gently and replied, It wasn't me who saved you. It was you who saved yourself. The breeze outside carried the salt of the sea. The beach house was ours again, and Henry's old truck still sat in the yard. But more important than those things, our family had found its bond again. Cassie was no longer the vain girl chasing illusions. She had become a woman who could face life with clear eyes, living not just for herself, but for others. And I, once a weary old woman who thought she had lost everything, now had a companion by my side, my own daughter. I believe Henry, wherever he is smiling too, knowing that what he left behind has become not just inheritance, but healing, rebuilding, and the start of a new life. From the day we met Gerald, I could see Cassie changing with each passing day. She no longer complained when she came home from her night shifts. Her hands were still raw from chemicals, her clothes still smelled of bleach, but the look in her eyes was different, no longer lost or ashamed, but steady, even quietly proud. One morning, as I was tidying up the kitchen, Cassie set her worn canvas bag on the table and said softly but firmly, "Mom, I've made my decision. I'm going to keep working there. Not for the money, but because I need the discipline. I need to do this myself, pay my own price, and stop depending on anyone else." I looked at her, and a deep, indescribable swell of emotion rose in me. Once, even the smallest scratch on her hand would send her wailing. Now she was choosing to carry on with such hard labor, both as a form of penance and as a way to redeem herself. I didn't stop her. I understood this was the right choice. Late at night, after she returned from work, we would sit together in the little kitchen. Cassie often poured 2 cups of tea, one for her and one for me. She would tell me about her co-workers from the night shift. Mrs. Patricia Green in her 60s, her back bent from years of toil yet still tireless. A poor student scraping together tuition, a single mother sacrificing sleep to feed her children. As Cassie spoke, her eyes shone with a compassion I had never seen in her before. One evening, she fell silent for a long time, then turned to me. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot. I want to go back to school. Not to study something flashy, but to study social work. I want to help women who've gone through what I did, lost, misguided, deceived. I want to be the hand they can hold on to instead of watching them sink deeper." For a moment, I was speechless. The same daughter who once dreamed of faraway trips and fine dining was now speaking of helping others. Slowly, I nodded, my voice trembling. "If that's what you want, I'll support you." If Henry could hear this, I know he'd be smiling. From then on, Cassie worked nights and studied by day. She signed up for classes, spent her afternoons poring over books, sometimes asking me to borrow materials for her. I saw the toll it took, the dark circles under her eyes, the weariness that made her slump over the table. But I also saw her persistence, her newfound resolve. One evening, she took my hand and said, "Mom, I don't want to just live off what you and Dad left. I want to do something with you so that what Dad left behind won't just be assets, but something meaningful for others." That was when the idea of a foundation was born. At first it was vague, but soon we began to plan. Together, Cassie and I decided to use part of Henry's estate to create a foundation in his name. It would support women who had been deceived, single mothers struggling to survive, and anyone who needed a chance to start over. On the day of the foundation's launch, Cassie trembled with nerves. She stood beside me, no longer the weak, weeping daughter who once begged to stay. On her face now was maturity, a woman who knew what she was doing. When she spoke a few words to the gathered crowd, her voice still wavered, but her eyes were steady. Watching her, I felt a great peace. My daughter had truly grown. From then on, our relationship also changed. It was no longer me instructing and her resisting. Now we sat side by side discussing studies, the foundation, life itself. I was still her mother, but we were also 2 women working together. She asked for my advice, listened, and offered her own views. What once felt like distance now felt like respect. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, Cassie smiled faintly. "Mom, I used to think you were too strict. Now I see. You let me fall so I could learn to stand. That pain, it saved me." I squeezed her hand and replied, "It wasn't me who saved you. It was you who saved yourself." The breeze carried the salty scent of the sea. The beach house was ours again, Henry's old truck still in the yard. But more important than any of that, Our family bond had been restored. Cassie was no longer the vain girl chasing illusions. She had become a woman who could face life with clear eyes, living not only for herself, but for others. And I, once an old woman who thought she had lost everything, now had a companion by my side, my own daughter. I believe Henry, wherever he is smiling, at peace, knowing that what he left behind has become more than inheritance. It has become healing, rebuilding, and the start of a new life. One day, Cassie turned to me and said, "Mom, let's go to the beach. I want to do something for Dad." We didn't prepare much. Just a few white chrysanthemums from the garden, arranged into a small wreath with some wildflowers tied around it. Simple as that. When we reached the beach house, my heart felt lighter. In the past, every time I came back here, all I felt was bitterness. But today was different. It felt like coming home. The two of us walked down to the sand. The waves rolled gently, not crashing, just murmuring like someone whispering. Cassie held the wreath, her eyes brimming, then turned to me and whispered, "Dad, I'm sorry. I made so many mistakes. But thanks to you, thanks to him, I finally understand. I promise from now on I'll live differently, with dignity." She bent down and set the wreath afloat. I stood beside her, holding her hand. We watched as it drifted further and further out, bobbing on the water's surface. I lifted my gaze, and somehow I felt Henry was still near, quietly smiling. We sat on the sand for a long time, saying nothing more, just listening to the waves, the wind. For the first time after everything, I felt truly at peace. I looked over and saw Cassie gazing out at the sea. In her eyes, there was no longer defiance or despair, but warmth and clarity. The girl who once scorned everything had become someone new. She had truly grown. I whispered as if speaking to Henry in the wind, "Rest easy, my love. She's learned to stand again. From now on, she and I will walk forward together." The sun rose, spilling light across the sea. The white wreath slowly disappeared into the waves. I knew then the past had closed and a new life had begun. Thank you for listening to this story today. I wish you and your family peace, health, and happiness. Don't forget to subscribe so you can continue this journey with us in the videos to come.